good morning, and welcome again to the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation's Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. We have a treat for you today. We have none other than Professor Brandon Robertson, and the topic is, are transcriptions worth it? Wow, I know this is going to be an awesome one. And just to remind everybody, please remain muted during the session. And if you have any questions, you can definitely go into our chat feature and type your question in there. We'll make sure we reserve some time at the end of the session to answer any questions, any feedback. We love to hear your feedback because it's vital because we're all learning from each other. And we hope you enjoy today's sessions. Don't forget, more upcoming free sessions will be posted at www.clearwaterjazz.com/education. And your feedback and any future session topic suggestions are welcome. Just email them to info@clearwaterjazz.com. And we would love to hear back from you on that. And just also, please be sure to check out the studio archives of past video sessions at clearwaterjazz.com education and outreach section, brought to you by Blue Water Wealth Management and Stewart Partners and Duke Energy, as well as our Young Lion podcast available wherever you stream. And that's brought to you by our friends over there at Marine Max Clearwater. And you can search wherever you stream and search on the Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Session. Just a couple of topics that Professor Robertson has brought to us. I'm going to read them off. I know you probably checked out a few of them, but if you haven't, you got to go back and check them out. So here's a few: playing duo performances, accompanying a vocalist. I bet that was great. Something we all need to learn how to do as musicians. Constructing bass lines, part 1 and 2. This was an awesome one here. Audition preparation. So if you missed that, you definitely have to check that out. And all my bass players here, left hand shapes for bass. I'm a trumpet player, but I think I could still learn a little bit of that. So just a little bit about Brandon. He's an Emmy-nominated music director, professional upright electric bassist, a composer, and music educator, originally from Tampa Bay.
813.
He completed his Bachelor's of Arts from Florida State University in 2009 and a Master's of Music in Jazz Studies in spring of 2016. Currently, Brandon is the Director of Jazz Studies and Director of the FGCU basketball band at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers, Florida. In 2018, Brandon was nominated for an Emmy Award for Best Documentary of Educational Collegiate Programs featuring the FGCU Jazz Ensemble. As a prominent band leader, Brandon has taken his band on multiple national tours, headlining at some of the top jazz venues in the country. To add to his impressive resume, Brandon has performed with notable acts such as the world-famous Count Basie Orchestra led by director Scotty Barnhart, vocalist Carmen Bradford, Jason Marcellus, Marcus Roberts, Marty Morrell, Wyclef Gordon, and the list goes on and on and on. Brandon has also been featured as performer and band leader at various national jazz festivals. And recently, Brandon released his first debut album entitled Based on a True Story in fall 2019, which reached all the way to number 16 on the iTunes Top 200 release. So, Professor Robertson, stage is all yours.
As usual, Michael, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation for always bringing me aboard. I love doing these sessions. And to everyone who's going to be watching this, welcome, welcome, and welcome. And thank you for my accompanist in the back. So let's get right into this. This is a topic that I strongly believe, and I really believe this wholeheartedly, that younger musicians nowadays kind of overlook the real theoretical side of transcriptions. And so today, are transcriptions really worth it in 2021 versus 2000 versus 1980. We're going to go all the way back because transcriptions have been happening for a long time. Now, I want to start with my experiences with transcriptions. When I was in high school, my band director, Howard W. Blake High School right there in Tampa, my band director, Mr. Robert Griffin, gave me a CD my freshman year. He says, Brandon, I want you to transcribe this album. Now, the word transcribe had no meaning to me. Coming in as a ninth grader, had no significant meaning. I had no clue what that meant. And I asked him, what do you want transcribing? What, how do I do that? He said, what I want you to do is I want you to listen to the bass player and I want you to verbatimly play exactly what you're hearing the bass player play. He said, I want you to start with the song, So What? He gave me a Miles Davis record called Kinda Blue. And he gave me this album and he said, I want you to listen to So What? This is Paul Chambers on bass. Look him up. He's a very significant bass player in the jazz idiom. You need to listen to this album. I said, okay. So when I started listening to it, I just listened. I didn't know what to listen for, other than he said listen for the bass, but I still didn't know what to listen for. So I want to start off by saying that if you're someone who's never transcribed before, don't start the transcription right away. Listen to the song or album or whatever it is that you're trying to value or listen to or transcribe. Listen to it first. Don't just dive right in and say, okay, I got to start learning the stuff, the solos, and don't do that. You need to give your brain some time to process all that information that you're receiving, because the retention span between what's happening in real time versus what you can process is very quick. So it requires some very disciplined listening. So I teach music appreciation, and one of the key things that I talk about in that class is engaged listening and attentiveness. And when you have attentiveness in your listening, in the way you hear things, you're more engaged and able to extract information a lot quicker, and you'll be able to remember it. And I'll give you an example. When you're learning your favorite song, a pop song or something that you hear on the radio, you notice that after about 2 or 3 times, you're starting to actually sing the song. You may not understand, you may not know in that moment, subconsciously you're doing it, but you've heard it so many times that you catch yourself like actually following along with the rhyme scheme. Your vocalies are starting to match certain pitches. Now you're able to learn the words in the real time the same way you have learned the music. It's the same process. So you have to listen. So I noticed nowadays when I teach my current students at the university, when I give them a transcription project, I can tell if they've actually listened to the song before they worked on it, because the way they will play it or they're skipping information, I can tell that they just were listening to it to learn it, but they weren't listening to it to engage themselves into what was happening. So when I started doing my transcription on Kinda Blue, it went right over my head. I totally wasted so much time, hours of just listening and trying to write it out, erasing it. And back then in my day, we didn't have YouTube. We didn't have the amazing slowdowner. We didn't have nothing that I can, in real time, slow down the speed of the song. I had to go to the library, put a CD in this big box, this stereo box, push it in, and then every time I wanted to go back and hear a certain part, I had to hit the little rewind button and hope that and pray that it didn't start it from the beginning of the song, because that would happen from time to time. That's the old school way. And that's how I was taught to transcribe, is you just got to listen to it over and over till you get it. So now I fast forward. I'm a professor now, and through my process in college, I actually learned that transcriptions are way more invaluable than we may perceive it to be. There's so much information and much more than just licks. So let's break this down. Here's step number 1. When you're transcribing, you want to, again, first listen and engage. And once you've gotten an understanding of the solo, let's use a solo for example, so we don't make it broad here. if you were transcribing a solo, you listen to that solo enough times to where now you're fully engaged. Your ear is starting to retain the phrasing, the harmonic presence, the rhythmic presence, everything, all the information you need that's going to help you learn it. You're starting to retain it. And once you do that process, that's step number one. Then step number two, I always tell my students, go to the piano. Don't even touch your instrument first. The instrument comes last. Go to the piano. Now that you've learned the solo, now that you can kind of sing the solo, and you know it because you won't forget it because you've been practicing it, singing along with it. Now sit at the piano and figure out the harmony. That is very important. Here's the disconnect that most young musicians have. When they're transcribing, they forget that those lines that they're transcribing is attached to chords. It's attached to a progression that's happening. If you don't understand how this line is moving in this progression, then that transcription is not going to make sense when you try to play it, because your ear is not going to be able to hear how it's moving. So you have to be able to internalize the harmony as well as the actual solo itself, the line itself. So sit at the piano, and if you don't know how to play piano, that's okay. If you can play block chords, the root, the third, and the fifth, that's all you need. You just need to hear the harmony, right? And what you do is you just hit the block chord, or I would say this, don't even do that first. Start with the root. Start with the bass note. So the bass note will always indicate how that harmony is moving, because bass players are playing usually are playing the root motion of the song. So you sit at the piano and then you play the transcription, and now you're listening to the piano player, because the piano player is playing over whatever that solo is or whatever that transcription is, unless you're a bass player. But if you're doing a horn, there usually is some harmony happening. And then you pluck out the bass notes, the bass root motion, so that way you can hear how it moves. And then how do you determine the harmony of the chord is by that third. So that third, either if you hear it as a major third or a minor third. So it's going to be one of those two. So if it's a major and you hear something that's kind of like very twilighty-ish, then you might have an augmented sound. If you hear something that's very daunting and super dark, it might be diminished. You know, it depends. But you want to figure out that harmony. And that might take you some time. But what you're doing is you're ear training. You're doing ear training at the same time. So that's point number two. Transcriptions help you develop your ear. It's not about just the phrasing of the lick that you're learning. You're actually training your ear to hear that phrase in real time in that harmony. So if that's the step that I feel a lot of young musicians miss, and I've had current students tell me, oh, the transcription will work less because I can just take the lick and I can just play it somewhere else. I'm like, you just missed the whole point of that. How are you going to extract that lick if you don't know how the harmony moves and you don't know how to apply it over that progression? That's the part that you need to understand. So that's part number two. So when you sit at the piano, you're figuring out the harmony. So once you figure out that harmony, now you've covered two things. You've learned the transcription audibly, so you didn't write it out yet. You've learned it, you internalized it. And I like to do it that way because when you play it, it's a lot more authentic. It feels more natural when you've learned it this way versus you reading it on a page, because now you're trying to interpret something on a page of a field. And I'm sorry, everyone, but jazz is not, you can't play jazz on a field on a page. You got to listen. So that is very important to understand too. If you write out a transcription, you have to listen to it to understand the feel of how that transcription works. You're not going to get that just by reading it. Okay. So sitting at the piano, figuring out the harmony. Once you do that part, once you've covered all of that, now you've retained it. Now you kind of understand how it moves. Now you can go and write it out. And when you're writing it out, because you want to learn it audibly first, you've internalized the rhythm. So that's the other part of transcriptions that some people miss. You're also internalizing rhythm. That is language. That's the language that we're referring to, aside from the melody, from the melodic content. That rhythmic content matters too, because there's a conversation that you hear between soloists and the rest of the band. Rhythmically, that's what's happening. We're playing off of each other, right? So you're taking now the rhythm and you're writing it out, you write out the transcription. And then you've already figured out the harmony. So now you can write out the chords. Okay, I would not refer for anyone to cheat and go find a fake lead sheet online or anything like that, because I can promise you right now the fake book has a lot of wrong changes. So if you want the real changes, listen to the record and then transcribe it from the record, because that is correct how they play it. Now obviously there's some records that they play wrong notes. They're humans. Come on, we everybody's not perfect, but the record is the record. That's the information, especially if it's an original version of that song. That would always be the correct framework that you want to reference to. So you write out the transcription, you write out the chords. Now, because you've learned it first audibly, now you can see everything. Now you have a clear picture of what you just did. And so once you figure that out, now what you want to do is say, okay, let me bracket off the sections that I like, the licks that I like. And you take that information with those chord changes over those licks. And what I tell my students is, I say, okay, pick 4 keys, pick 2 flat keys and pick 2 sharp keys, because you never know if it's a standard. Majority of the time, at least from my experience, a lot of singers do not sing in flat keys. So I have to be prepared that I can transpose, or I know songs in different keys. So that way, if they say, oh, let's do it in A, okay, I don't get thrown off and say, whoa, I don't know what to do. So that's an example of how transcriptions can also help in those scenarios. So once you write out the transcription, you have everything there, you take the lick and you transpose that lick in different keys. And then the last part of it is what I tell my students is I say, okay, I give all my students a list of jazz standards, about 150 standards that they should know. And I say, now, I'm going to show you something here. Majority of these standards, a lot of these standards were written during the Tin Pan Alley era. And so you got composers like Jerome Kern, Richard Rodgers, Cole Porter, the Gershwin brothers. You have all of these, Oscar Hammerstein. You got all of these wonderful, wonderful composers who was writing all these Broadway pieces, but eventually turned into jazz standards. So a lot of the progressions are the same. A lot of these chord progressions transcend over and they overlap in different songs. So I was able to show an example of, let's take this lick. So I had my student learn Autumn Leaves. I took that as an example. They took a lick from Autumn Leaves, transposed it in different keys. Then I said, now look at this progression. This same progression can fit on all the things you are. The first 4 bars, they move in fourths. The first 4 bars in Autumn Leaves, they move in fourths. So I showed them how this lick can extract and move on this same chord progression. The chord changes are different, but the progression is the same. That's the part that I want to push, that I want to stress. My last point here today that students miss is that when you can understand that the harmonies, once you learn standards and you listen to a lot of jazz, your ear is going to start picking up on these harmonies. You're going to say, wait a minute, this sounds exactly the same as this. So I can actually play this lick over this and it'll work. And that's the information in the language that we refer to as educators when we're teaching our students. When we tell our students, you need to learn the language, it's not about the notes. It's a lot more to that. So when you're a child, your parents don't really teach you how to walk. You crawl, and then somehow one day you stand up, and then your parents go, wait a minute, they stood up. And they're looking at you funny, and you're like, why are you looking at me funny? Because you stood up. You've been crawling for months, and all of a sudden you stood up, right? And then you take a step, but then you fall. You stand back up. You take another step. It's a process. So with transcriptions, to all of the young musicians who are going to watch this, that is a process. It's a skill that you have to inquire and do over time. But the skill sets that are going to come with that is you're going to have a much stronger ear, your retention span is going to be a lot sharper, and the way you react in real time will be a lot more fluid, because within transcriptions there's discipline behind that. There's a lot of structural discipline as a musician when you're playing and you're focused and you're listening and you're really engaged on what's happening. That's what transcriptions do. So to the whole point of my topic is, are transcriptions worth it? Yes, they are worth it, but they're worth it if you know how to utilize them. And I feel that sometimes students will get overwhelmed by the information that they're hearing, and they'll tell themselves, I don't know this. You actually do. You actually know a lot more than you think. It's just that in real time, it's so overwhelming and there's a lot of information being thrown at you. You have to process it. So it's kind of like if you're in a circle with your friends and all your friends are talking, but then you're having a conversation with just one person, but everybody else around you is talking. It's the same exact concept on the bandstand. There's a soloist talking to somebody on the band, but there's other conversations happening, but we're all simultaneously still in sync with each other. And with transcriptions, it teaches you rhythmically, how do you function and navigate through your band? It teaches you harmonically, how do I hear changes in real time without being flustered? It also teaches you how to conceptually play solos without it sounding staggered, because we all know when you talk to someone who does like a bunch of run-on sentences, you're like, okay, when are you gonna stop? But if you take pauses, let somebody else speak, you take another pause, let someone else speak, then there's a dialogue. So the whole point of this is, if you're gonna do a transcription, okay, take the time to really study the information you're listening to. Don't just listen to it, learn it, show off to your friends, oh, I can play it now, but then you forget it like a week later. Then you wasted all that time for nothing. So you want to make sure that when you're working on transcriptions, you are taking your time. You are actually trying to study what it is, the information that you're trying to extract and retain, so that way when you do present it in your own playing, it sounds authentic and it doesn't sound like, okay, I just played a Charlie Parker lick. That's cool. You played a Charlie Parker lick. There's nothing wrong with that. But did you play it with your feel, with your ideas? See, I can play a lot of Charlie Parker licks in my solos, but it will sound like Brandon is playing with an influence. People will hear that and they'll say, okay, I can hear the influence of whatever he's checking out. It's not, oh man, he literally played this solo from Blues for Alice, and he quoted Bard. They don't do that. That's not what the transcription is for. It's not to show off that you can play like somebody else. It's for you to learn how to play the music that you're studying. So overall, that's my whole topic, and I hope that was helpful for everyone. But I really needed to drive that home and make sure that folks know that when you do these transcriptions, it's a lot more information than just the lick. So
the lick. That's great information, Brandon. Quick question. So I know we talked about from the perspective of the student, the beginning student, or just entry level in transcribing. As a seasoned musician or a professional musician, is it important that you continue to transcribe, or do you just drop that skill off the planet and say, hey, I'm here, I don't have to do that anymore?
No, I still transcribe, but I don't do it to the degree as how I used to when I was in college. Like the way I transcribe now is I like to keep fresh ideas, so I'm always trying to keep up with current stuff that's out. And if I hear something that I like, I'll learn it, but then I'll learn it from the perspective of, oh, that's just that's like new information that I can use on something. Like if I'm trying to come up with a groove idea, and I hear a bass player. Like I was listening to Ben Williams the other day, and a bass player, and he was playing this groove, and like, man, that groove it was just a pocket feel, like, because he was doing electric, and it was just a feel he was putting in a pocket. So I was like, man. So I learned it. I was like, oh man, okay. And so, but then it sparked some other ideas of how I can approach bass lines for like on my upright. And so I started coming up with cool bass lines for like different standards or for songs I'm working on. Well, I use transcriptions now more so as to kind of stay fresh, not go stale with my ideas, even though I'm very creative on my own. But the music kind of recycles itself. So there's nothing wrong with you taking things from others, as long as it's used tastefully and not like, okay, I'm just gonna take your lick and try to steal it, not like that. So I do think it's important. I know a lot of seasoned musicians who still do it. I know some who just don't. They're like, I'm never transcribed, and they sound great. But it just depends on the person, and their preference.
Okay. Yeah, my next question was, what are you working on right now as far as what do you listen to? But I think you really kind of went into that. Now, another question just came in. And by the way, if you're on and you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat. We'll love to hear from you. The next thing with the transcription, is it possible for someone to transcribe so much that we don't get a glimpse of who they are? And every time
Yes.
they solo, maybe we hear all Miles, we hear, all Cannonball, but we never get to hear what their creativity is. Is it possible that sometimes people abuse transcriptions?
I think it's a subconscious thing, and a self, it's like a self-awareness thing. Like, long time I didn't know what I sounded like. Like, I know what I sound like, but I didn't know if people could identify what I sound like. Like, I've never had people come up to me and say, "Oh, you sound like Christian or Paul Chambers," or bass players that I really look up to and I've studied. But there's a fear. And I don't want to speak for every single musician, but there's a fear of acceptance. Every musician has gone through this. Like, is whatever I play acceptable to my peers? Like, especially if it's a group of peers that you want to be a part of you want to be in that circle, and you get a chance to play with those individuals, but then you have this fear of, do I sound like whatever? So then you start learning all of this information, and then it becomes a point where it's like, okay, like that people can start quoting what you're doing. I've seen that happen where I won't say, but I was actually on a gig just a few years ago, and I was playing with an individual down in my area, and he started playing all of this, this Sonny Rollins stuff. And a guy in the audience who I didn't even could tell that dude knew jazz at all, but he starts quoting the record from wherever he was pulling that from. And I was like, I've never seen that happen before. And, I don't think the guy, I don't think he cared, but it was just for a moment for me. I was like, I don't want somebody calling me out saying I sound like this person, like I want to sound like me. So I think I don't think folks abuse it, but there is a conscious thing of, well, if I learn all of these solos, I would sound so tight and great that people would just say I'm a virtuosic soloist. But then it gets to that where it'd be like, well, you sound like Miles in the 60s or this like that. So my advice let me give you advice to answer, to kind of go off of that. My advice is, don't be afraid to do you. And as cliche as that sound, Marcus Roberts told me that one time on the bandstand. I don't want you playing like Paul Chambers. Brandon, play you, do you. I remember him yelling that at me on the bandstand one time. I was like, okay. And I still in that moment didn't know what he meant. It wasn't until I actually, to answer your question, Michael, it wasn't until I started working on my album. That's when I started discovering what I sound like. People tell me they can hear me, but I've never listened to me. Like, I've never heard me for me, because I'm the person doing it. And so when I started working on my album and I had to go back and listen to the cuts, I started hearing me, and I was like, oh, okay, this is what I sound like. And so you have to be okay with what you sound like, and you have to be acceptance of, this is the thumbprint that God gave you. It's only one. I like this line from Kanye West. Kanye West is a little, whatever, but I like this line on the song Power. He says, it's 1,000 yous, but it's only one of me. That's facts. There are a gazillion million people on this planet. It's only one Brandon. It's only one Michael. It's only one LaRue. It's only one Steve. It's only one Deb. It's only one of us. So that uniqueness has to be on the forefront. And that is what separates you from everyone else. Even if it doesn't sound tasteful to that particular person, that person can never be you and you can never be them. So as long as you are aware that your individuality is unique and it's special and it's a great thing to be different, then you won't have an issue with sounding the way you sound when you play. So a transcription won't really define that, because you're using the transcription just to elevate your sound. That's the whole point of the transcription, is to elevate your sound, not for you to sound like that. So I hope that answered your question.
Oh yeah, that definitely answers the question. And you almost opened up another can of worms when you're talking about listening to yourself. You know, I battle with this, and so many musicians I know, I mean, they play beautifully and they do so awesome, but one thing they hate doing is just listening to themselves or listen to a recording. And I think sometimes we listen with the intent where we're hearing imperfections. Ooh. You know, and that's one of the things as a band director, I struggled with listening with enjoyment. It was always, listen to intonation. That's sharp. The articulation. And it's like you have to cut that off sometimes and just enjoy it. And I've heard plenty of recordings, I mean, from Roy Hargrove and all kinds of people where I hear mistakes, and it's like, they was like, whatever. It's going to be in the recording. Who cares? It's great. It's going to be what it's going to be. So, you know, to the musician that just hate listening to themselves or have a problem with just cutting that part off, what kind of advice could you give that musician?
Okay, I'll go. There's two parts to that, and I can make them brief, but there's two parts to that. So part one is knowing what you're listening for. You know, first, when you listen back to yourself, don't ever first listen to it with that kind of mindset, like you stated, with the imperfection mindset. Listen to it as if you were the audience member and you were at the concert watching yourself play. Because that's a different pair of ears. That's a different pair of listening. There's a different viewpoint of that. So when I'm on stage, I'm a performer. So when I listen, I'm listening from a performer standpoint. What did I do wrong? Did I do this? I worked on this. Did I make it happen? When I'm an audience member listening, I don't care about none of that stuff, because I'm just listening if it sounds good. And if the overall feel of what I'm hearing sounds good, then I actually did my job. I did what I was supposed to do, regardless of how I felt about how I sounded. If I contribute to the overall greatness of whatever was happening, and I'm listening as an audience member and I was satisfied with that, then that's different. Then that's actually a good thing. So sometimes when we go back and listen to ourselves, we need to first just listen to it regularly. So I'll give you an example. My buddy LaRue here is on the screen with me. Me and him just did a show together. And we did this concert, Herbie Hancock Chick Corea's. Now actually, I recorded myself on my phone, just like audio, just when we played the Armando's Roomba. Because I was telling LaRue in soundcheck, I am freaking out about this song. Only not because it's you know, I can play it. It's just a very heavy bass note song that's just all up and down the bass. So I went back and listened to it driving home. And I only listened to it as if I was there at the concert. I didn't want to listen to it from that perspective because I already knew what I was going to do. I was going to turn it off because I was like, oh God, this is so terrible. And then I actually was like, wait a minute. Man, it wasn't that bad. Like, man, I was actually able to hang. And I felt different because I wasn't trying to listen to it from like, okay, Brandon, what did you do wrong? I'll worry about that later. I wanted to enjoy that moment because I remember how hard I worked on that song. So I just wanted to enjoy that moment of just listening to it, listening back, hearing what we did. And I think if you start listening to yourself from that perspective first before you go back and fix whatever, I think it'll alleviate some of the insecurities that musicians feel when they go back and listen to themselves and say, all right, it's not that bad. It's not as bad as I thought. It's just that this little thing that I lost lack of focus on, maybe when I practice, I need to work on that. So that's the second part of it. That's why I say it's two parts to it. The first part should just be engaged listening. The second part should be your awareness. So now, okay, let me find what I did wrong and then go from there. And then I can work on things. I make my bass students in my studio. It's a requirement in their syllabus and in my class. I make them record their lessons, and I also make them videotape themselves when they practice. So I'll ask them every week in their lesson, just show me one video of yourself practicing. And then they'll show me, and then I'll say, okay, look at yourself. Look at what you're doing. Look at how you're standing. Do you look like you're enjoying yourself? Do you look like you're actually having fun? Those things matter. Because if you're a musician if you don't feel like you're enjoying what you're doing, there's no way the audience is going to buy into what you do. So there's so much value in going back to listening to yourself. And as hard as it is, and even me being a seasoned musician, I do it all the time and I still hate it. But I know at the point in my life, I'm more mature enough to know what I need to listen for. So now I've gotten to the place where okay, I need to stop beating myself up, and I really need to just enjoy what I did. Because I only live one life, and I can't go back and change it. It's in history. Anything I played 10 years ago is in history. I can't go back and change that. That's forever the print that's out in the world, in the universe. So I hope they're not elongated, but when you go to all the musicians who have this fear of listening to themselves, you can only get better if you know what to fix. And if you don't go and listen to yourself, you're going to still sound like trash later on, because you will never know what you need to improve. And it's okay to improve your sound. That's okay. It's actually a really good thing. So I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, that definitely answered questions. I know we took a lot of twists and turns today. Talk about the value of transcriptions, and listening is vital when it comes to that technique. So we want to thank you, Brandon, for sharing that knowledge, that wisdom with us today. We want to thank everyone who joined us. Keep telling other people about what you're hearing here on these live sessions, the Young Line, our virtual sessions. Invite them in. We love your feedback. Don't forget, you can check out the free sessions upcoming. Just go to the website, www.clearwaterjazz.com/education. And also, if there's something that you want to talk about, email us at info@clearwaterjazz.com. We hope to see you out in the community playing and just enjoying jazz. We will see you on the next one.
All right, guys.
All right.
Take care. Have a good one.